when Aristotle talks about ethics, he first wants to establish like the methodology that we should use to try to create like these ethical frameworks, right? So he talks about virtue, and we can do this one of two ways, right? We can go about this by finding people who we would universally agree are virtuous, right? Like a general in this war or whatever, right, is like clearly someone who exemplifies courage. And then from there, we could dissect what exactly it is about his behaviors that are courageous. Or what we could do is we could instead find things that we believe to be core virtues, right? Like courage is inherently virtuous. What does it mean to be courageous? And then we can find people to map those onto, right? And the whole idea is like we're trying to enrich our own lives and be better people. Like it's not a theoretical conversation. He really wants it to be a practical kind of thing. But this really brings up something about the nature of categorizations, right? And I'm curious about this with action adventure stuff. Like we could talk about quintessential action adventure games. Like for me, that would be like Zelda. And we can dissect what elements in Zelda are like, you know, are the things that make it action adventure. Or we could talk about we could create our own criteria for action adventure and then see if Zelda lives up to that. Maybe we wouldn't want to say that Zelda is action adventure despite the fact that it seems to ring true, right? So how do you feel about that? Do you have a particular methodology that speaks to you? Do you want to talk about specific action adventure games and then dissect them? Or do you want to like say what you think good action adventure mechanics are, and then we could throw some spaghetti at the wall and figure out what sticks?
I think it's worthwhile to just first start by kind of loosely defining action adventure. So you brought up Legend of Zelda, which I think is great, and it fits the definition in that action will relate to, say, combat or like high intensity gameplay. Adventure will relate to exploration and maybe more of the like problem solving puzzle aspect of games. So Zelda fits this criteria in that with your Hylian sword and shield, you go around killing bokoblins and what other creatures of the night to eventually make it to Ganon, but it presents you with adventure in this vast, new, unexplored land that you slowly uncover by like moving yourself around the map, and then dungeons or shrines or just rooms that present these puzzles, be it like a logic focused puzzle or one where you need to kind of like platform around a little bit. I think in presenting those two types of gameplay so frequently alternating, it hits action adventure actually like really well. So I think if we use those parameters and examples, we can say, yeah, Legend of Zelda is actually a really good example of an action adventure because it never leans too much into the action. It never leans too much into the adventure. I would say sometimes there are puzzles where like you're really just like banging your head against the wall trying to figure it out. And oftentimes I think those puzzles are failures because you shouldn't be that perplexed by a Legend of Zelda puzzle, in my opinion. But part of the adventure is overcoming great challenge, and if great challenge is a logic challenge, so be it.
What about something like Hades, right? Like Hades doesn't really have any puzzle solving, and you are kind of exploring these dungeons, but the exploration is very limited. I don't even know if we'd want to call it exploration. And there are slight choices that you get to make. Like, do I want to go into this room, like a room with X reward, or do I want to go into a room with Y reward? Or this is going to be an elite boss versus, you know, right? So those are
I don't think there's any exploration in Hades.
Okay.
Like, sure, you're going into new rooms, but to a degree, the contents of the room are telegraphed to you via the icons above the door. You kind of have you understand what locales you're in.
And you also can't go backward.
You can't go backwards. There's no puzzles either. So yeah, I think it loses the not exploration, but it loses the adventure aspect, even though it does present, say, a narrative adventure.
Okay, so what are some of the edge cases? What do you think is something that is like, you know, maybe a little too action to be action adventure, like not enough action, so it's leaning more on the adventure side?
I would call Call of Duty definitely the high action side of the spectrum. If we were calling action adventure a spectrum, action on the left side, adventure on the right, I think Call of Duty would be your farthest left handle. It is...
Well, you'd have to have them on different axes, right? So like high adventure...
I see, okay.
Right, so like Call of Duty, I would agree with you, is very low adventure, very high action.
Yeah.
But what would you say would be like high action and like very mild adventure? Like not enough adventure to make it action adventure.
High action but low adventure. I would almost I mean, I easily just think of like more like indie games. So high action. Oh, wait. Do you mean low adventure in the sense that it is still an action adventure game, but it's just kind of like way lower on the adventure spectrum?
Something that would be controversial. So something where it might, like, some people might categorize it as an action adventure. I'm thinking like maybe Celeste. Do you, like, maybe some people would consider that
that's
action
a platformer.
Adventure. It is a platformer, definitely.
Action
there's probably no
usually
action. Yeah, there's no
action. Is, I would
combat.
say, yeah, action is just another word for combat most of the time. I haven't really seen action exchange anything else. So we're talking about games that have combat and adventure. We need a game with a lot of combat but a little bit of adventure.
What's that game with where you play as like the enemy, like the evil monster? It's like very red.
Carry On.
Carry On. Thank you. Yes. What about that? That's definitely action. And
actually, that could fit action
it's
adventure.
Metroidvania.
Yeah, it's Metroidvania.
Puzzle solving.
It could sort of fit action adventure. Like, yeah, we could loosely slap it into there because there's lots of combat. You are going from like place to place to place, and there is a story being told across this like big site. So I would, yeah, sure, I could consider that loosely an action adventure game, even though like I would more so put it in the I don't want to say Metroidvania.
It definitth is.
Metroidvania is, but like
that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not an action adventure though. Like Ori, I think, is action adventure and both action adventure and Metroidvania.
I think Ori does action adventure, or I think it does the adventure aspect of action adventure very well, while also having the Metroidvania framework. And the reason I'm hesitant to say Metroidvania is more so of a like college exercise of not using games to describe other games. And Metroidvania is the prime example because if nobody knows what a Metroid game is or a Castlevania game is, they are completely lost. So I need to remember what the better word we used there is, but we're basically talking about games with high emphasis on like exploration, backtracking, and unlocks.
Yes. Oh, love it. Yes.
Yeah. So we'll figure out a better word for that. I
think Metroidvania at this point has like transcended specific references to Metroid or Castlevania. You know, like I have played a bunch of Metroidvanias, but I've never played a Castlevania, but I am very confident that I could define a Metroid. I have no qualms using the word Metroidvania, despite the fact that the latter half of that word is a reference to a game that I'm not familiar with directly.
Yeah, from a fully outsider perspective, it just doesn't explain what the mechanic / genre is at all. That's like the biggest problem. Action adventure, you kind of know what you're getting. Survival horror, you kind of know what you're getting. Metroidvania, you don't know what the hell.
Yeah.
So anyway, that is to say, maybe we talk about that in another bonus bite where we break down Metroidvania and try to come up with a better genre classification for it.
Yo, that sounds like an excuse to talk about DK64. What's up?
And Shadow Complex, one of my favorite Metroidvanias.
Tell me about your thoughts on like RPG elements and like those kinds of mechanics. And if you want to define some of them, you know, like experience bars or something like that, talent trees, throw out whatever you want. How do you feel that those fit into action adventure? Is that something that's been more common in recent years? Is it something that you think kind of puts it in a different category? Like, are action RPGs and action adventure games like overlapping? Should they be considered distinct? What do you think?
I think RPG elements, much like rogue-like elements, are starting to transcend genre. I don't know if that's going to be a permanent state of things, but much like Wisecrack's video on how comedy movies started dying down because comedy started getting injected into all movies, it transcended just a singular genre. I feel like these RPG mechanics, like skill trees that feed into skill points that are acquired through exploration or combat of some sort, maybe a leveling up system without skill points, whatever. like these things can be injected into almost every and any game. Like I've seen racing games have an RPG system, which is like
That
wild.
is wild.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I'm trying to think. What, you have like an extra second of turbo? Like, what is this?
No, you played
Anti-lock
this game.
brakes?
It's Forza Horizon 4. Like that has a
wow.
whole, it's a whole car PG basically. And that same studio, Playground Games, they're making the new Fable game now. So that is funny and it makes sense. So like, I think, you know, tying it back to RPG elements in games, yeah, I think RPG has transcended. Like, RPG is certainly a genre in and of itself, and we know what that genre looks and feels like. You know, it is a Final Fantasy, it is a Mass Effect, and it is a Yeek. Y2K. But like they are presented in different ways, and obviously these RPGs have like super emphasis on things outside of what, say, an action adventure would have emphasis on. So that's where like lifting elements of a genre is good, because you don't have to put in the full commitment of like players having to expect a 40-hour game or super long dialogues that may not necessarily be voice acted.
Yeah, it's like Breath of the Wild having a crafting system in like the potions and stuff that you make, like the food and all of that. Like you have to cook, and that is basically like a Minecraft crafting system, just over a fire, you know. And like a lot of games have those now, and it's not necessarily like considered like a component of a creative type of game. Like a game that has a creative mode is what I'm trying to say. Minecraft has a creative mode, Fortnite has a creative mode, where you can just go in and build stuff and do your, you know, crafting types of exercises. Breath of the Wild doesn't have that, but they still feel like it's like almost like a mainstream enough mechanic that it needs to be in the game.
Well, something that should be said about that with the crafting and the food, Ryan, is that is playing more towards the survival aspect of that game, because Breath of the Wild, I think, is the only Zelda game to introduce this kind of like survivalist game loop to the whole series. Mm-hmm. You're not necessarily crafting to build shelter or anything like that, which games like Minecraft and Roblox or whatever, they let you do, because, you know, surviving is half the game, and then building your house and, you know, a whole community is the other half. Whereas in Zelda, it's mostly just surviving and completing the adventure. So I think that's why, at least in that case, they don't have a creative mode.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I agree with you. And I also like what you said about the like role playing mechanics, like RPG mechanics being woven in. And I like that for the most part. I don't really like the survival creative thing in Zelda. I didn't really, it didn't work for me. And I don't know if I have like a good reason for that, or like anything that's worthy of like, you know, time. But yeah, all of this to say, I mostly like the RPG mechanics being woven into the game, into different games. I also think that like RPG really isn't enough of a genre on its own, because it needs to be modified, like action RPG or turn-based RPG. Like if you told me you're playing an RPG, I don't really know what to expect, and I need you to like continue to describe it for me to like kind of have a fully fleshed out picture, or even a partially fleshed out picture of like what I would be doing in that game.
I think I kind of disagree with you there. I feel like RPG as a whole, and this may start to get into different bonus Byte territory, but RPG as a whole, I think, has pillars that you can sort of always depend on. Like I made reference to the 40-hour epic storyline. I made reference to like a gaggle cast of characters, right? Like long dialogues.
But we have Japanese RPGs, and we have like Western RPGs.
Right, yeah. We have a healthy plethora of sub-genres within the genre of RPG, but that is to say that all of these sub-genres still have the mainstays of like the main thing, right? The big cast of characters, the long story, the yada yada yada. Like those will always be there, even though you can help people by saying JRPG, turn-based RPG, action RPG, yeah, that, and so on and so forth.